Why did everyone vote the way they did? At the end of Mockingjay, when Snow is defeated, Coin calls together the 7 remaining living victors to a vote. Coin proposes to mark the end of the war, they hold a symbolic Hunger Games using the capital's children. And despite the fact that the majority of these victors, everyone bar one, was fighting for the revolution, it's interesting that they vote for these Hunger Games. So why did everyone vote the way they did? To start us off, let's discuss the against. Peeta, Annie, and Beetee all vote against these games occurring. And Peeta and Annie are the 2 first to really speak out against it. We don't know much about Annie other than what we know of her through Finnick. But what we know from her games, we know that she wasn't really a killer. Though she came from a career district and was likely a career herself, it's not known whether she killed a single person in her games. So we can assume that Annie voted no because she has always been against the idea of the Hunger Games. And the idea of killing another individual in the name of peace has never sat right with her. With Peeta, his thinking aligns a lot with Annie's, but we know him more as a character. And out of everyone in that room, Peeta and Joanna almost have the most right to be angry and furious and want revenge. Because not only did the both of them have to be put into the Hunger Games twice, they also had their entire family slaughtered, and then they were captured by the Capitol and tortured by Snow. And one of the most drastic things that happens to Peeta during this torture is that he is hijacked, and his once peaceful dandelion in the spring thinking becomes violent. His mind and his motives are twisted to the point where he feels he has to kill Katniss first before she kills him. And this is completely unlike the Peeta we knew before, because the Peeta we know would rarely attack first. And that's not to say that he wouldn't kill and that he wouldn't protect people, it's to essentially say that he wouldn't be the one to throw the first punch. And when Katniss comes to see him after his rescue, he doesn't think, he just attacks. And so Peeta voting against these new Hunger Games is actually really indicative of his healing process. We know that he still has conflicting memories and conflicting ideals, and that's likely something he will suffer from his whole life. But he has healed enough to remember who he was and what he truly believed in. And I think the core of Peeta's very character is being loving and being caring. And so the idea of another Hunger Games to him is genuinely unthinkable. Even if it could satiate the need for blood as Coin defends it. Peeta cannot for a second even imagine that it's the right thing to do. And so Peeta votes no. And before we discuss Beetee, I want to quickly discuss Joanna. Joanna and Peeta have suffered a very similar fate from the Hunger Games and from Snow's regime. She even jokes that they were cellmates and were very familiar with each other's screams. And I think this is a lot more symbolic of them being very similar as characters and living almost parallel lives. But they are fundamentally different people. Because what drives Peeta is being loving and being caring for other people. What drives Joanna is her own inner anger and fury and need for revenge. And this isn't to say that Joanna is inherently a bad person. It just means that her main motivations come from an internal source. And so when Joanna votes yes for the Capital Children, she's not really thinking of anyone else but her own pain. And this is completely understandable for what she has been through. And I also think a part of Joanna finds this whole situation comical. Because of course they weren't going to be safe. Because of course another Hunger Games was going to be proposed. And so where Peeta is still fighting for the peace, Joanna has kind of given up by that point. And so yes, let another Hunger Games happen. Why not? Let it drive deeper into that pain that's already festering inside of her. And so Joanna votes yes. And then we reach Beetee. And Beetee is one of the more interesting characters that we never really get to touch on. He comes from District 3, which isn't actually a career district, but is sandwiched by them. And he didn't win his games through active killing, he won it through a passive method. And by that, I don't mean that he didn't win his games by not killing people. He did, he killed a lot of people. I mean that it wasn't him running up to someone with a knife and stabbing them. It was him using his creation to kill people. And Beetee has always been a character who is able to distance himself from the actions he's doing because he's a scientist. He thinks very much in black and white. And very similar to the great scientists of our world and the great thinkers, he creates things because he can. And because it's good science. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't feel for the consequences of his creations. Because it wasn't just Gale who designed the bomb that blew up the Capital Children and Prim, it was also Beetee. And we never see Beetee's side of this. We never see whether he realizes that it was his creation. But he must have known, because Beetee is not a stupid person. He also recognizes his own creations almost immediately. But we never get to see whether or not Beetee actually feels the guilt for what happened with the Capital Children and Prim. But we can hope that he does feel a bit of guilt for this, because he does vote no for these new Hunger Games. And he says that we have got to stop viewing each other as enemies. And I wonder if that is also him talking to himself. And so we have 3 who vote against: Beetee, Peeta, and Annie. Joanna votes yes for these next Hunger Games, as does Anabaria. And Enobaria, I can see her voting yes for a similar reason that Joanna did. We know very, very little about Enobaria as a character. We don't really understand her motivations. We don't really understand why she thinks the way she does. But from what I can gather from what we have, I would assume it is to do with her own personal anger and need for revenge. And so Enobaria, Joanna have voted yes, and the vote comes down to Katniss and Haymitch. And everyone wants to know why Katniss voted yes. Why would she think to do that? And I think the answer is both very simple, but also is encompassing of what has happened throughout the entire book. Throughout the whole book, Coin and Katniss have not trusted each other, to the point where even Boggs admits that Coin might be trying to kill Katniss. And though Katniss made Coin promise that she gets to be the one to kill Snow, there's no guarantee that that would happen. There's no real guarantee that anything will happen for Katniss anymore, because Prim has died, and that was the one constant thing she was fighting for. Had Katniss not gone to speak to Snow before she went into this vote, I do not believe that she would have voted yes. Because in Katniss's mind, though she didn't like Coin, Snow was the real enemy. That was what she had realized at the end of the second book, that Snow was the real enemy, the Capitol were the ones they were trying to defeat. And Coin, though she didn't like her, she was fighting for the right side. And then Prim dies, and Katniss meets with Snow, and Snow essentially tells her that she's smarter than this, that she knows that Snow would not be wasteful enough to kill an entire pen full of Capitol children. And it's in this moment that Katniss realizes that one person stood to gain the most from that bombing. And it's here where Katniss realizes that she is not yet out of the games. And I think Katniss is mulling over what to do in this situation. And then Coin announces that she wants to hold a symbolic Hunger Games using the Capitol's children. And she uses the same rhetoric that they have all been fed their whole lives, that this will satiate the need for blood, that this is in the name of peace. And I think in that moment, the second Coin announces that she wants to host a symbolic Hunger Games, that's it for Katniss. That is the final nail in the coffin, and she knows that she has to kill Coin. But the only way to get close enough to Coin to do that is to get Coin to trust her. Katniss has been fighting against Coin the entire book. Their ideals do not match. They do not get along. And I have a theory that Coin suspects that Katniss will vote against these new Hunger Games. But Katniss votes for them, and she says she's doing it for Prim. And this means that Katniss is trying to avenge her sister. And that solidifies the trust for Coin, because she believes that Katniss is avenging her sister because Snow killed her. And Katniss is avenging Prim, just not in the way that Coin expects. So Katniss votes yes for these new Hunger Games in order to get an opportunity to end them once and for all. And then we get to Haymitch. One of the core things that is present throughout the entire series is that Katniss and Haymitch are sometimes the only two people who understand each other. They are very similar in their ways of thinking, and oftentimes they don't even need to communicate directly to know what the other is thinking. And I think in the moment that Katniss realizes just how bad Coin is when she announces the symbolic Hunger Games, Haymitch realizes the same thing. It's also important to note that only Beetee, Katniss, and Haymitch were in District 13 with Coin for the majority of the final book. And Beetee spent the majority of his time in weapons creation. Katniss and Haymitch spent the majority of their time in command, together with Coin. They know who this woman is. They know how she operates. And Haymitch likely spent even more time with her while Katniss was fighting on the front lines. And so while all the rest of the victors in that room are done in one way or another, Peter, Annie, and Beetee are all looking to the end of the war. Joanna and Enobaria have accepted their fate that they are going to be in the games for the rest of their lives. Katniss and Haymitch both see the final piece they need to move to properly win the games. And Katniss says it in the book, she does it in the movie. She looks at Haymitch and it's a test as to whether they truly know each other. And they do. And though Haymitch might not know exactly what Katniss is planning, he trusts her more than he trusts anyone else on that table. And if she's voting yes, then it must be for a damn good reason. And so Haymitch votes yes. And I think the entire voting scene really comes down to a game of trust. It is the ultimate test and the ultimate finale for these Hunger Games. And I also want to say, because there seems to be some debate about it, but I do not think that these Hunger Games occurred after Coin died. But that is why I believe that everyone voted the way they did in that final scene.